We're here in studio once again as we watch some scenes of across Canada. Soon you'll see our lovely and smiling faces once again appearing on your Facebook page live from the Radio Canada International web. Oh, there we are. It's me. It's Mark Montgomery. And with me, of course, is the lovely and talented Lynn Desjardins.
Hi there.
The talented and lovely, what's your name again? Terry Haig.
My name is Jose Manis.
Jose Manis.
An astronaut.
Terry Haig is with us once again, a master of sports. And of course, the lovely and talented and sophisticated Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And in the control room, controlling us and wondering what the heck we're doing most of the time is Charles-Antoine Lemay and Benoit Durand. And of course, the ever mysterious Pierre Dutil, who this week is sporting a beard.
Yes.
It's amazing because he can grow a beard very quickly. You know, he shaves
true,
it
I
off.
haven't
He
noticed.
comes in and he says, "Who's that guy?" And he says, "I'm Pierre." So, "Oh yeah, we recognize you now." But then the next week he comes in, he's got a full beard. It's amazing.
And he can solve any problem anyone might have.
And
this place goes to pieces when he's not around.
It's true. He goes on vacation and everything falls apart. The place is lost.
Incredible.
We won't even be on the air. When Pierre's on vacation, we won't be here.
Yeah, I'm booking my time to coincide with his time.
Well, after all the fun and games, we do have a very serious program for you today. Lynn, what do you have?
Ooh, I'll tell you about pediatricians asking to provide all Canadian youth under 25 with free and confidential access to birth control.
And Terry?
I'll have a rather shocking statistic that over the past 20 years, over 200 coaches or trainers have been convicted of sexual offenses against the kids they're training. And I'll speak with the head of the Coaching Association of Canada about that.
All right, Marie-Claude, you have some color and light in this
Yes, I'll
world
tell
of
you.
misery and problems.
Yeah. I'll tell you about an iconic festival in Canada involving a flower.
All righty-o. And I'd just like to take a moment to say hello to our listeners on World Radio Paris and the shortwave service in Germany and Kauri 97.5 Radio Nigeria.
And you haven't told us what you're going to do.
Oh, that's right. What am I going to do? Well, it's very...
Most important story of the
no,
week, of the month.
Well, it is actually quite shocking. It's a UN report on the potential disappearance of millions.
Oh, my God.
A million species around Canada. It's very serious. And
Around
we'll
the
hear
world.
around the world, yes. We'll hear about that in just a moment, coming up on The Link Online. Indeed, we're going to start out with this story, which is, is quite shocking. It's a UN report on the environment, which was released this week, and it said up to 1 million species are potentially facing extinction within the next several decades. And they say, unless we change our consumptive ways. Now, what we mean by that is we have to stop overfishing, we have to stop excess extraction industry activities, excess illegal forestry, for example, and of course polluting, which is warming the environment. Now, I spoke to Jeremy Kerr, who is a professor of biology and the research chair in macroecology and conservation at the University of Ottawa, to get his thoughts on this multi-year global study.
Well, in some respects, the news is a little bit worse than we had initially hoped to see. When you see a big synthesis report like this, of course, what you are seeing is all of the world's scientific evidence put together in a single picture. And I'm afraid that big picture is worrying. And that full picture basically demonstrates for us that, yes, indeed, people are already being affected in important ways by the loss of nature, but also that the kind of repair job that we need to do if we want for ourselves a reasonable future.
Now, they've said about 1 million species of plants and animals and marine life and so on may go extinct within a short period of time. How many species can we afford to lose?
There's no good answer to that question, and when we examine what the science actually says about the extinction of species, it turns out that even species which appear to not do anything terribly important, nevertheless sometimes play roles that are essential in ecosystems. So I don't think there's a way to say that we can safely degrade the worldwide web of biological diversity at all. What we're really looking at here is a choice for humanity. What do we want to do with our future? And what do we want to do with the futures for our kids?
When we lose a species, is that not kind of like an untested experiment?
Yeah, it's basically the dumbest experiment that humanity can do. The first thing you have to understand is that the scientific evidence demonstrates with the utmost clarity that humanity requires this diverse array of life in the world to provide us with services that we cannot do without. Things like oxygen, these are sort of important. So it is species in the world that give us those services that we cannot do without. That is essentially to say that humanity lives at the top of a very complicated scaffold. And that scaffold is made up of all of the species in the world. That holds us up, that gives us the things we need to be who we are, to live our lives, to have the things that we want to have. Now, what we're doing by causing extinctions is we're reaching down below the top level of that scaffold with a sledgehammer, and we are whacking out the support bars. And then what happens is we don't know, right? So you whack out one of those bars on that scaffold and maybe everything's okay. You lose a few hundred species in one part of the world. Maybe the scaffold doesn't collapse. But if you keep doing that, sooner or later, something really bad is going to happen. And this is the question that we have to grapple with, and we have to grapple with it right now. And it's very simple. And again, this is based on the scientific evidence. But when you continuously degrade the scaffold that we require to survive as a species, you risk our capacity to continue to exist in ways that we would find reasonable. And so ultimately, what the question is? Do you want your kids to live in a world that resembles something like a disaster movie? Or do you want them to enjoy the sort of stability that we grew up with?
And that was my conversation with Jeremy Kerr, Professor of Biology and Research Chair in Macroecology and Conservation at the University of Ottawa. And as he was talking about how we're at the top of the scaffold and whacking out support structures underneath, I thought of that game called Jenga. It's a game. You pile the blocks up, and then the game is to remove one, and whoever removes the one that falls over, you lose, kind of thing. But I thought that's exactly what it is we're on top of the ecology scale, and by doing what we're doing to the environment, we're slowly pulling out the blocks underneath us, and eventually, as Jeremy Kerr said, it's going to collapse, and it's going to have pretty serious consequences for humanity. So, it's a bit of a scary scenario. And of course, the other thing is that something I didn't realize is that we all know we've lost a couple of species, right, that have gone extinct. The dodo, for example, but there are something like 500 species that humans used for food that have gone extinct, and I wasn't aware of that. And since the last several centuries, we've lost literally hundreds of species. And okay, as Jeremy said, you lose a few species and maybe things are okay, but eventually, as you cut down all the forests and you fish out the oceans and this and that and the other thing, bleach the corals because the ocean is warming, something's going to happen, because the world is all designed to be interconnected. Mm-hmm. And you start unconnecting all the connections and it just falls apart. So it's a pretty serious issue and a pretty serious story. And if you want to find out more about it, you can go to the website, see the full story, hear the full interview, and there are some links on there as well. Coming up, taking a look at contraception. Well, Canadian pediatricians came out with a position statement that may have, I guess, startled some conservative parents.
Oh, I think so, Mark. The Canadian Pediatric Society wants all young Canadians under the age of 25 to be able to get effective contraceptives at no cost and with a guarantee of confidentiality. Now, the doctors argue that cost is a barrier to birth control for many young people, and consequently, many don't use contraceptives, and as a result, there are thousands of unwanted pregnancies every year in Canada. The position position, as you say, is bound to be unpopular with more conservative people, but probably popular with the more progressive parents. To find out why the pediatricians took this stand, I spoke with Dr. Margot Lane. She's an adolescent medical specialist, and she's also on the Adolescent Health Committee of the Canadian Pediatric Society.
In Canada, many young people are not accessing contraception because, even though they're sexually active, because they either can't afford the cost, or because in order to have it covered, say, by their parents' insurance, it would mean that they actually have to discuss the fact that they're sexually active and wanting to be on contraception with their parents, and certainly some teens are not comfortable in doing that. So what we are wanting is for there to be a availability across the country, in all regions of the country, for teenagers and young adults to be able to access effective contraception without financial cost upfront to them. What we know in Canada is that depending on where a young woman might live, that she would go and see a healthcare provider and discuss contraception with the healthcare provider and come to a decision about what would be the best form of contraception for her. And then typically she's given a prescription and then would have to go to a pharmacy to access that contraception, and she would have to pay for it. And the reality is that that's expensive on the budget that teenagers and young adults live on, and it ends up being prohibitive for many young people. Consequently, we know that many young people who are sexually active and not wanting to become pregnant are not using effective contraception.
And what are the consequences of that?
Well, it ends up meaning that we have thousands of young women getting pregnant every year in Canada, even though they are not wishing to become pregnant. And in the end, this has several downstream effects in terms of then leaving a young woman in the situation where she's having to make a decision about whether or not she wants to terminate the pregnancy or proceed with the pregnancy. If she proceeds with the pregnancy, this has multiple effects for her in terms of her overall situation once she becomes a parent. We know that young women in Canada who become pregnant are less likely to complete their schooling. They are less likely to pursue post-secondary education. In turn, that sets them up so they have fewer high-quality job options. And we know that young women who become parents early have a higher chance of having to rely on social welfare programs for support. So really this has multiple effects, not just for the young woman herself, ultimately for her family, and really broader society.
So Dr. Margot Lane points out that, governments are often motivated by cost and may say, well, it would be very expensive to provide contraceptives to everyone. But she says that in the long run, the cost of providing free contraceptives outweighs, is actually far less than the cost of unwanted pregnancies, both in terms of, when there's a pregnancy, you have to provide the medical care, but also in terms of the social costs for what she just mentioned before. Now, these are just recommendations from the pediatricians. Whether it's actually taken up, it remains to be seen. Healthcare in Canada is provided in most cases by the provinces and the territories, and they have really dramatically varying ways that they handle health care and contraception and so on. So, this is something that the doctors are recommending, and we'll have to see who takes it up and who doesn't.
Indeed, in our society, in our political structure, you might have one province who does it and the next province doesn't, kind of thing. It could end up being kind of piecemeal and patchy, which
Indeed.
is if adopted at all, because of course everybody's worried about cost. But the trouble with politics is they're worried about the cost
In the short term.
In the short term, and not the long-term costs.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing where it's the long-term costs that are evident from not doing this kind of thing.
That's
So,
absolutely right.
any thoughts, anybody?
What a species we are. If
Well-
there's a million going to die, if there was one that would, well, you know, I mean, things would go way better if, first of all, if we listened to women, like the doctor here. I'm serious, you know.
Listen to me.
My bank is run by women now. It is such a pleasure to go in there. Laughs, nice, beautiful, young people, and it's what it's going to be in about 200 years when women run the world, hopefully.
If we're still around
if
by
we're
then.
still around.
If we're still around, because don't forget the first story, you know.
Yeah.
No, that's what I'm saying. I mean, there's only one species that's got to clean up its act. For
Yeah,
the other million to survive. I mean, it's pretty evident.
Yeah, you don't see giraffes ruining the world, right?
Giraffes?
They're not ruining the world. You know, and whales aren't polluting and cutting down forests.
And they're not getting any unwanted pregnancies, are they, right?
Oh, well, that
Well, we don't know.
I don't know.
All right, Terry,
Let's not
you're
go there.
coming up right after this. All right, a story about sports figures across Canada have gathered in Ottawa to seek some solutions to a growing problem, sexual abuse and other mistreatment of Canadian athletes. And in attendance are, at that meeting, were athletes, coaches, leaders from some of Canada's 170 different sports federations, and it was just the latest in a series of meetings, pointed all in the same direction, and it's possibly due to a publication of a CBC News investigation in February that found that at least 222 coaches and other people in influential positions in sports who were involved in amateur sports have been convicted of sexual offenses over the past 20 years. And there were more than 600 victims who were under 18 years of age. And Terry, give us a bit more on this story.
600 families ruined, eh? I spoke with the organizer of the meeting. Her name is Lorraine Lafreniere. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Coaching Association of Canada. She called the results of the CBC News investigation gut-wrenching. I spoke with her. I asked her about the abusers and their modus operandi.
Well, listen, there's a lot of research and experts in that field, but predators are predators, and they look for points of access. So whether it's the Scouts, the Catholic Church, daycare, the school, they typically come in with an intent to abuse.
Okay.
There's research on circumstantial predators, but that, let's leave that for another day. The reality is that what we're trying to establish is the standards expected, the standard behaviors expected of the coach, of officials, of people in the clubhouse. And that comes to some very important factors. One is screening and criminal record checks, which is just one prevention. Training and education, so how you need to behave properly and understand the boundaries of coaching. And the third is actually the rule of two. So when there are more than two adults present, then that actually prohibits a lot of the behaviors or points of access, because we know that groomers or predators are really good at starting to isolate a person, and that's usually how abuse happens. So really this is about changing the sports system so the access point is removed for predators.
Okay. But the thing is, if they're cagey, they can, there's no 100% guarantee you're going to catch any of these people, given the fact that they absolutely have no morals whatsoever, apparently, to betray a kid. What is worse than betraying a kid?
There is nothing worse. As a parent, I'm sure we all agree.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, predators are predators. And what is, for me, the challenge in society, if we really want to get into it, is people think they can spot good people and bad people. Well, that is like the best false notion there is. It's not about being a good person or a bad person. It's actually about the professional boundaries that any job function should have. So an easy example is if I'm a coach, I shouldn't be texting my 13-year-old athlete at 1 a.m. drunk. I mean, like just taking it to those extreme forms. And so, ultimately, you're right. There is no moral compass in there as far as we know. And so it's just setting up the standards. And so, I can't convey enough how important it is that, predators can be incredibly charismatic people, because that's actually what gives them access. They groom the individual and the gatekeepers around the individual, whether it's the person who has the keys to the clubhouse, the parents, or other administrators, into thinking they're the most caring, wonderful person, and that's what gives them the point of access. So we need to remove that from the thinking, and we actually need to say, this is just about professional boundaries. It's not about you being a good or a bad person. You're never alone with a child, full stop.
That was part of my conversation with Lorraine Lafreniere. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Coaching Association of Canada, who organized a 2-day meeting in Ottawa this week, bringing together people from sports in an effort to find some solutions to the abuse that the CBC uncovered. And it's what you have to remember here is, I don't know if any of you guys play sports a lot, but when you're growing up, when you play sports, the most precious person, even more important than your parents, is your coach, usually. I mean, that's the guy you trust. And what these people do is just appalling. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I like the rule of two rule. That, I mean, this is what our society's come to. I don't know if it's always been like this. I was thinking about it when I did this story. I was really lucky. I had great coaches when I was growing up, and nobody ever sort of came on to me or anything else like that. And your heart breaks for, especially the young women, but anybody, a young person who is betrayed like this by someone he or she totally trusts. It's awful.
Yeah, as the woman pointed out there, it's not just sports, it's also the church and other aspects of growing up as well, where people are in a position of influence and trust. And I can't imagine what it would be like years later to have to deal with that stigma of a child that has been abused. I mean,
it's a lifelong.
You never get over it.
But I mean, I too, growing up, you're involved in minor sports and so on, and everything was cool. And I wonder about that, as you said, what was it in fact always like this, and we just didn't notice, or was it in fact a different time?
I think a lot of it is that it happened, but it was not talked about. It was not open. It wasn't out in the open. It wasn't discussed. But I find that now, like when I had a child 27 years ago, she was very small when I was having to leave her with other caregivers, and I found myself in the awkward position of having to arm her and finding a way to not scare her, but to arm her to beware and to always tell me if there was anything that she was not comfortable with. And that's what it's come to. I mean, these days, it's good that associations, sporting outfits, and so on are looking at ways to prevent it from happening. But I think parents really need to arm their children, sadly.
Well, parents, though, these days, and I was talking about this with one of our colleagues, Paloma Martinez, about something else. Parents many times are so busy working 2 jobs now. When I grew up, there was only one person in our family that worked, but working 2 jobs. Kids are latchkey kids. They're vulnerable. They're around. Sometimes they go to the school and they might think that their parents are ignoring them, and that's what brings them to a coaching situation where the coach can read it and take advantage of them. I mean, it is up to parents for sure, but parents are working way too hard to even look after their kids.
I think it's great and positive that this coach association is making real concrete, it's the kind of a first, because we often talk about it and everybody's appalled, but there's nothing really concrete being done. I just hope it's going to be done, as you said, in other fields too, like in the arts or wherever, because it can
happen anywhere.
Well, it's happening in the arts. Me too.
Yeah.
For sure.
And also the penalties are getting stronger, and there's more of a push to prosecute, which that we didn't see in the past. Now there's prosecutions happening.
But on the
as you
other
mentioned.
side of the coin is now there's more opportunities for these people through things like social media and so on and so forth. You know, which is so. As we get more regulations and more aware, at the same time, there's more opportunities for these people to exploit. So it's a delicate situation.
I guess the biggest problem is silence. So as
Is
long
silence?
as long as people will break the silence in any way, that would be the.
Well, on that note, let's move on to something
Happier.
a little happier after some of these serious discussions. And now we turn to you, the beacon
As always.
the beacon of light in this dark world.
First of all, we have two people that are saying hi to us. We have Joël Honoré Kouam from Cameroon. Hi,
Hello.
Joël.
Hi.
And we have, of course, Christophe Sajewicz from Poland.
Yes.
So
Hey,
thank you for being with
dzień
us.
Embiid's going down, Joel. He's going down to the Raptors, okay?
So,
Don't alienate them.
so this weekend is
they're
Mother's
from
Day.
Europe.
Mother's Day.
And what
on
would be
Sunday.
the best Canadian activity to do on a sunny Sunday on Mother's Day?
Watch basketball.
Well, I suggest going to the Tulip Festival in Ottawa, the Canadian Tulip Festival.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
So I've never been there, but I've always wanted to go.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It is beautiful.
You have
Yeah,
to go.
imagine. Well, we have a little promotional video from the Tourism Ottawa, but I think it's going to give us a little idea. We can start with
When you
that.
visit the Canadian Tulip Festival in Ottawa, remember this. All of those beautiful blooms belong to you. They are a gift to all Canadians from the Netherlands for Canada's role helping the Dutch during the Second World War. That bike isn't yours, but you can rent one and take a ride to see your tulips. Ottawa, this is your place.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm a bit
So-
ashamed to say that I didn't know there was an actual very serious historic
Oh,
reason why we have a
absolutely.
tulip
Queen
festival.
Queen of Holland, right? Didn't they
Oh,
bring
there's
us
One
the
of
tulips?
them. There's at least two big reasons. We had
Yes.
a princess, a Netherlands princess
During the
born
war.
here.
Yeah,
And
she was born here, and they temporarily declared the hospital room where she was born as Dutch territory so that she would be a Dutch citizen.
Wow.
Yes, and the family, we have to say, the reason the family was here was they were sheltering from World War II.
From the Nazi occupation.
From the Nazi occupation. And of course, the second thing,
Yeah.
a huge story, which unfortunately is not taught well enough, in my opinion, in Canadian schools, is the incredible role that the Canadian forces played in liberating the Netherlands. There was starvation under Nazi occupation. There was illness. It was incredibly dire. Terrible, terrible situation, and the Canadian forces went in. And you know more about this. You're the military historian in the family.
Well, in fact, there's a really kind of interesting, wild story about this. It was, I believe, May the 5th. There was a rumor that came through to the Dutch underground that the Germans wanted to talk about the situation with the Dutch starving. So a couple of Canadian officers hopped in a Jeep. Now, these are two known colorful characters at the time. They hopped in a Jeep, stuck a white flag on it, and had the driver drive them into German territory. Now, the officer who was in a Canadian uniform, he was actually a Brit, but he was working with the Canadian Army, he spoke a little German. So they bluffed their way through the German lines and got to the headquarters of the German forces in the Northwest Europe and talked to the general about this. And he agreed to let the Canadian forces have free passage to bring food into the starving Dutch.
Yeah. And as a gift after the war,
Oh.
the Netherlands government gave us hundreds of thousands of tulips, and every year they did. And
They still do. All
they
the time.
still do.
Every year,
So
right?
in 1953, that's when the festival started.
So, well,
we
finish
have
the
nice
story.
images
Well,
that we
that's
can
it.
show. Of,
The Canadians came in and they started to feed. It was called Op Manna, manna from heaven kind of thing. And they came in and began feeding, and they probably saved literally thousands and thousands of lives from people starving. And it was just a couple of days later that the German forces actually surrendered in northwestern Europe. And shortly thereafter, all German forces surrendered May 8th.
Yeah, it's an
And
amazing
to this
story.
day, the Dutch are grateful to Canadians.
Yeah, and next year it's going to be the 75th anniversary
Yes.
of that event. So
Liberation.
Well, we're
the
almost out of
festival
time,
will be.
so we have to say goodbye.
Yep.
We have to say goodbye. So thank you very much for joining us, and take care until next week here on The Link on Radio Canada International.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.